Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and Happy New Year. So to kick off this year, I wanted to go through my eyeshadow palette collection. This is always one of my favorite videos to film for you all and my favorite videos to watch from other people as well. So I hope you all enjoy. This is going to be a bit of a longer video, just because I do have quite a few palettes to talk about today, so be sure to settle in. But before we get started, I do just want to say I do have a slightly larger collection. I think just around 80 palettes within my collection. You in no means have to have this many. I am in no way trying to brag. This is just something I enjoy. Eyeshadow palettes are something I enjoy collecting. So I just wanted to share that with you all today. This is also not going to be a declutter. I did declutter a few palettes towards the end of the year, but it didn't really seem significant enough to talk about. So I'm just going to go through all the palettes that are staying in my collection. Alright, so I have a few baskets of eyeshadow palettes, and I'm just going to go through each of them. They are organized by brand, so that is how this video is going to be broken down. So starting with e.l.f. Cosmetics, this is their Retro Paradise palette. This palette is discontinued now. I do have probably quite a few discontinued palettes within my collection that I still absolutely love, and this one is definitely one of them. I just think this color story is so fun. I always enjoy reaching into this palette, and it has a good formula. This is slightly older in my collection. I feel like a couple years old, but it still performs really nicely. The color story is super fun and exciting, and yeah, I do really love this one. It is definitely one of my top favorites in my collection. Alright, next we are going to jump right into iHeart Revolution, which is the brand I own the most palettes from. So this first one up here is from their Dr. Seuss collab. All of my palettes, I think, from iHeart Revolution are from their collabs. And this is the Oh the Places You'll Go palette, another one of my top favorite palettes within my collection. I just think the color story of this one is so cute, and the formula is really nice again, and there's just something about like the feeling of this packaging, the feeling of this palette, the color story, everything about it just really speaks to me, and I find it super fun and easy to reach for. Alright, next up from the Looney Tunes collab, this is their Tweety palette. Tweety is my favorite Looney Tunes character, so when they came out with this, I just knew I had to pick it up, and the color story in here is super cute as well. This is definitely not a palette I reach for as much as some of the other ones within my collection, but there are definitely days where I do feel like reaching for this one and creating some fun looks. I like that I can create more neutral looks, but you can also add in a fun pop of pink or yellow to just kind of spice up the look a little bit. Alright, now moving on, we have the entire Disney Princess collection from iHeart Revolution. So this is the Moana palette. I love the color story of this one. I think it is beautiful. This column of mattes here just really speaks to me every single time I open up this palette. And another thing I love about this one is that they did bronzers over here. The rest of the palettes all have blush in them for this first column, but this one was fun because it had the bronzers, and I just think this is a beautiful palette, and for all of these, I have just loved collecting them. Alright, next up we have the Tangled palette. This is one of my favorites from this collection. I think the color story in here is just really pretty, and you get a good amount of variety. I love the purple shades mixed with the pinks and the greens. You do get a pop of blue, which I don't use a ton, but I feel like within this palette there are a lot of looks that you can create, but I'm not super overwhelmed by this color story, which is super nice. Next up we have the Mulan palette. So this one is probably my least favorite within this Disney Princess collection. This is a color story that just kind of confuses me a little bit, and I'm not always entirely sure what I want to do with it when I reach into this palette. With that said, I have been getting more into it lately. I have been thinking about reaching for it more and actually wanting to put it on my eyes, which is good because I do really love this collection. Even if this isn't a favorite palette of mine, I still want to get use out of it. So I am happy that I'm starting to be a little more drawn to it, but this color story, like I said, just is not my absolute favorite, but it's still a nice palette and I'm still happy to have it as a part of this collection. Alright, next up we have the Snow White palette. I also just love how these all look like books. These are typically displayed on a bookshelf that I have, and I think they look so pretty when they are. I love this color story. I loved it from the moment that I opened this palette up. I am a big primary colors fan, and I love that you get all of those fun pops in here along with the greens, but you also get your more neutral shades as well. Putting the prints through the crease and diamonds and rubies on the lid is a super simple look, but it is so pretty and one of my go-tos with this palette. So it is definitely a palette I need to reach for more. Most of my palettes are, but I do really enjoy this one. Next up we have their Sleeping Beauty palette. This is one of my least used from 2023. I feel like I just really wasn't reaching into this. This one is another one that the color story confuses me a little bit, not as much as the Mulan one. This one excites me a little bit more just because you have some different fun pops of color within it, but it's definitely not one that I find I am gravitating towards over other palettes within my collection. But again, I love having this Disney Princess collection. It is not something I am going to get rid of. So it is a palette I do want to reach for more, but I still love having it within my collection. Alright, then we have the Aladdin palette, a little bit more on the neutral side, which I do really enjoy. I find this palette to be one of the easier ones to reach for from this collection. I find that the looks I create are always really nice and simple, but you still definitely get some fun pops of color within this palette, which is super fun. And again, just really enjoy this palette. With all of these palettes, the formula can be a little hit or miss. I feel like this palette specifically has one of the better formulas from this collection, but they are still a more affordable brand, so you're kind of getting what you pay for, but there are some shades that perform really nicely, and this palette specifically I feel like has quite a few of those shades. Next up we have the Little Mermaid. So this one has some really fun kind of more pastel colors, and I just really enjoy the color story of this one. I feel like it's very summery, and that is definitely the time of year that I find I am reaching into this one the most. I feel like spring, summer for the kind of pastel and then some brighter looks as well. Same kind of thing with the rest of these palettes. I definitely need to reach for more, but it is super pretty and I'm so happy to have it. Alright, 3 more to talk about from this collection, this brand. So this is their Princess and the Frog palette. This one is a little bit on the deeper side, which I think is really nice, especially for it being the Tiana palette. And I think the color story in here is absolutely gorgeous. This top half of the palette just really speaks to me every single time I open this up. The pinks and the greens in here, I wouldn't necessarily think they go together super well, but they do in my mind, and I just love what they look like together in these pans, and it makes me excited to reach for this one. This is one of my favorites within this collection, so definitely a fun one to have and a fun one to play with. Alright, next up we have the Cinderella palette. So this one is the kind of blue cool toned palette from this collection. This one, when I first got it, was not a favorite of mine, but it has definitely grown on me, which is super nice. There are some shades in here that really speak to me, and I have enjoyed playing with a lot of the shades in here. This is definitely a go-to palette when I want to reach into blues, especially the shimmers. The matte blues are not my favorite, but the shimmers in here do perform really nicely, and like I said, this one has definitely grown on me, and I love having it as part of this collection. Alright, and the last palette up from this collection is the Beauty and the Beast. This one I think has become my favorite from this iHeart Revolution Princess collection. It is, I would say, the most neutral out of all of them, but there is something kind of special and unique about this palette that makes it definitely exciting. I mean, you do have more than just neutrals in this, which is super nice. But I just find whenever I look into this palette, I am excited to reach for it. I think it also is my most used, so I'm motivated to kind of show more progress within this palette. But yeah, I definitely love this palette, and it is my favorite from this iHeart Revolution collection. Alright, moving on, we have NYX. So I have two palettes from them. This first one is their Ultimate Utopia palette. This is the first palette that I ever got from them, and it's still a favorite within my collection. I think it's super fun. You'll notice a theme with quite a few of my palettes is I really like a mix of neutral and colorful shadows, and I feel like this one does it really well. I like the fact that you can create definitely a more neutral brown look, but you have some fun pops in here as well. The formula is pretty nice, so this is definitely a favorite of mine. Alright, then one of my newest palettes within my collection is the Flamingo Frost palette from NYX. This was their holiday release from 2023, and I immediately knew that I was going to want to pick this one up. I love flamingos, and I love the color story of this palette, so it really just worked out super well that this palette just really spoke to me. And again, neutrals, colors, I just really think this color story is super cute, and I feel like there is quite a bit of variety within here as well. And yeah, I just really love this palette. And if you're interested in seeing any videos with these palettes, let me know. I believe, have a video with each of the palettes within my collection, but if you would like to see more, please do let me know, and I would be happy to film those for you. Alright, next up we have Milani. This is their Soft and Sultry palette. This is definitely an older palette. I don't even think they make this one anymore, but this is, if I'm going for neutrals, this is my go-to neutral palette. This is a palette I love to bring with me when I travel anywhere. It has a nice hard protective case, and when I'm traveling, I'm not doing super elaborate eye looks, so this one is just absolutely perfect. And honestly, one of the main reasons I do keep this one around. It's not the most exciting, but it is definitely a staple within my collection. Alright, then on the warm tone end of that one, this is my Tartelette Toasted palette. This one was my very first high-end palette within my collection. Granted, I did get it for half off, but it was still a super exciting purchase for me just because when I was first starting makeup, I was definitely more in the drugstore area just because I wasn't spending a ton of money on palettes. And as I started to get into it, I started to put a little bit more money into it. And this one was just super exciting for me just because I had been wanting it for a while, and especially at the time I purchased this, warm tone neutrals were my go-to, so this one got a ton of use from me, especially when I first bought it. I still do enjoy it for the warm tone neutrals. They're not something I'm reaching for as often these days, but when I want those, I know I have this palette and I still really enjoy it. Alright, next up we have some palettes from IBY Beauty. This one is their Boho palette. This one is super cute. I bought this one right when they released it, and it's not a palette I reach for a ton, but when I do reach into it, I feel like the looks I create are super cute, and I love the shimmers in here especially. I feel like one of the reasons that I don't reach for a ton are the mattes in here. I feel like don't really go with the shimmers. I've created looks where I've worked them in together, but I feel like I would have liked some more neutral mattes instead of the yellow and the orange. to go with these more colorful shimmers, but it does pair well nicely with other palettes, and like I said, the shimmers in here I think are super cute and fun to use. Alright, and then I have the Wonderland palette from IBY, and this one is probably my favorite over the Boho palette. I definitely like the neutrals in here, and you get a few fun pops of color as well. I have been reaching into the neutrals within this palette quite a few times, especially in 2023. I have found this to kind of be my go-to neutral palette for the past year, so that was super fun. I definitely want to play more with the other shades in here as well, and not just focus on the neutrals, but this is a really nice palette, great formula, and I was super happy to kind of test this brand out, and I still really enjoy using this palette. Alright, the next palette I want to talk about is very special to me. So this is my Mockingbird Beauty Mockingbird palette, and if you have not seen my other videos before, this is actually a makeup brand that I started, and I am so proud of this palette. So little hand-drawn bird on the front here, and then I hand designed this entire palette from the color story to the shades to the packaging. All of it is completely hand designed by me, and I'm just so proud of this one. It is a super cute, cool toned color story, and I have been loving it, especially during these more winter months. I have used this one year round as well, but I will have my website linked down below if you are interested in checking it out. I also have my Mockingbird Beauty Instagram page if you would like to go follow me over there, see any updates or sales I will be having in the future. And yeah, thank you to everyone who has supported me, and if you are interested in a palette, please go pick one up. I would really appreciate it, and I'm not gonna ramble too much about this palette, but if you are interested, I do have videos and stuff on it. But yeah, I'm so proud of this one. Alright, next palette I want to talk about is my Delancey Panda palette. So this is definitely not a palette I am using a ton. I bought this one purely because I felt like I was really lacking grays in my collection, and grays aren't something I'm going to be reaching for every day, but there are special occasions when I really wanted them, and I felt like this palette had some really nice ones. I like that they're slightly more on the warm tone side. I feel like that looks better on my eyes. So this is definitely, like I said, not a palette I'm going to be reaching for a ton, but it's definitely one that kind of fills a gap that I had within my collection. So it's really nice for that reason. Alright, next up we have Ulta Beauty. So I got their entire Hogwarts House palette collection. They have discontinued these now, but I still really enjoy them. I know a lot of people, I felt like, didn't really enjoy these palettes that much, but I think they're super cute. So this is the Gryffindor palette. This is one of the more reached for ones from this collection. I think the color story in here is super nice, and I am a Gryffindor, so this one kind of speaks to me for that reason. This is nice for kind of everyday looks for me when I kind of want a more pinky, purpley red look. I am definitely going to be reaching for this palette. Alright, next up we have the Hufflepuff palette. This color story is not my favorite. It might be my least favorite out of the 4 house palettes. I just don't really like the addition of like the purples and grays within this palette. I understand like Hufflepuff's house colors kind of go with that, but I would have liked to see this done maybe a little bit differently. But with that said, this Galleon shade is like my favorite yellow shade within my collection, and Lumos and Golden Snitch are 2 very beautiful shimmers. So there are definitely shades in here that I like, but there are also just a few that aren't my favorite. Next up is the Ravenclaw palette, and this one might be my favorite out of the 4 houses. I just really like the mix of the couple brown mattes in here with the blues. This Twilight shade down here is one of my favorites. I definitely find that I gravitate towards darker blue shades with looks. just because I find those easier to use like on my outer corner when creating looks. So this is a very pretty palette. A lot of shades in here that I really do enjoy. The formula is really nice on these. So yeah, this one was definitely a good one. And then last but not least is the Slytherin palette. So this one's probably my least used just because it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone. It has like the green shades. So next up we have the Slytherin palette from Ulta, and this one is probably my least used out of this collection. Just with the color story, it's a little out of my comfort zone. I definitely love green eyeshadows, but I would rather pair them with neutrals, and there aren't too many like true neutral shades within this palette. With that said, I think it's a really fun color story, and when I want to get out of my comfort zone, this one is perfect. But it's just one that I'm not reaching for every day, but it's still fun to have, and I'm a big Harry Potter fan, so having this collection is super fun. Next up we have Profusion, and this is my only palette from them. This is the Mixed Metals Peach palette. I'm not sure if you can even get this one anymore, but I purchased this one like 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. And it still actually performs pretty nicely. It's not one I'm reaching for a ton, just because it is more on the kind of neutral side, and it's not the most exciting color story, but it's still a pretty palette, and there are shades in here that I do enjoy, and like I said, the formula still seems to be pretty good on it, and I would like to get a few more pans and some usage on this before I probably declutter it at some point in the future. Alright, next up we have Juvia's Place. So this is my Sweet Pinks palette by them. This is a newer one within my collection, and I talked about this a little bit in my ranking my 2023 palettes video, but this one was not my favorite, and that is pretty much only because it is an obviously monochromatic palette, and I'm just not really reaching for bright pinks on a daily basis. But when I do want pinks, this is a really nice palette. I don't have a palette with multiple pinks in it, so this one kind of did fill a hole in my collection, but it's just not going to be one that I'm reaching for every day. So next up is the Nomad by Juvia's Place. This one is such a gorgeous fall tone palette. I really love it. I feel like you can see some usage on this middle shade. It is a gorgeous lid shade. I don't reach for this a ton outside of the fall season, but once we get into those few months of fall, this is definitely a go-to for me. And the formula is really nice, and I just really do enjoy this palette. Even if I'm not reaching for it a ton all year round, it definitely has a spot in my collection, and I still very much enjoy this palette. Next up is the newest palette within my collection. This one is from Clarity Cosmetics. It's their Evil Mermaid palette. I bought this one when they were doing one of their scavenger hunts, and I will be honest, this is not a favorite palette of mine. I have only tested it out a couple of times, but it's very messy, and I'm not sure if that has to do with the fact that the shades are kind of broken. They came a little broken, so it was definitely messy to begin with, but I feel like there was just a lot of fallout when I was using it, so not my favorite, but I do still want to give it another chance. The shimmers in here are absolutely gorgeous, but like I said, lots of fallout in my experience. Next up we have Kylo, formerly Muse Beauty, and this brand is actually not around anymore, but I do have 2 palettes from them. And this first one is the Triumph of Venus palette. So when I first got this one, I was super obsessed with the color story. I thought it was gorgeous, but I will be honest, I have not used this one in a very long time. I just kind of got uninspired by it a little bit. Looking into it now, I think it's really beautiful. I love these blue shades up here. So I think I definitely want to make it a goal for myself to kind of retest this palette out in this next year, see how I like it, just because I want to definitely be getting use out of my palettes. Even if it's just a handful of uses, I just want to know that I'm using the ones within my collection, and this is one that definitely got neglected last year, so I feel like I really do want to make more of an effort to use this one. And then we have the Rococo palette from Kylo, and I was obsessed with this color story when I first saw this come out, and I waited a while before picking it up, and I still do think the color story of this is beautiful. There are some shades in here that I really do like, but I will be honest, the formula of this is not my favorite. I feel like the mattes especially are on the lighter side. They don't build up to too much pigmentation, but it is nice for softer looks. I really love these orangey shades within here, and I definitely want to get some more use out of those. I think the shimmers in here perform pretty nicely from what I have tested out recently, so definitely one I want to continue to use. Like I said, I love the color story of this one. It's really exciting to me, so definitely want to put in some good use on this one. Alright, then we have my Glitter Realm A Whole New World palette. This is one of my favorites within my collection. I have used this one so much, and every time I look into it, I just feel so inspired. It is absolutely gorgeous. I think the color story is great. The formula is great. This is getting to be a little bit of an older palette within my collection, and I feel like it still performs just as good as it did when I first bought it. I'm not sure if this brand is even around anymore, but I absolutely love this palette and will continue to love it forever, I am sure. I can never get enough of this one. Alright, we are moving on to another basket here. Alright, next we can move on to ColourPop. So I have quite a few of their collab palettes. So this one is their Harry Potter Back to Hogwarts palette. I really like the color story of this one. When I first bought it, I had kind of wished that they had split the palette up into 4 different house palettes, but I feel like you would have pretty much gotten this exact color story just in 4 different palettes anyway, so it's not actually a big deal to me. And I really do like the combination of the colors in here. You definitely get a lot of variety with the number of shades that are in this palette. And I also think it's fun that you get to test out a lot of ColourPop's formulas within this. You have your classic mattes and shimmers, but you also get the sequin mattes, a super shock shadow, a glitter, so definitely a wide range of formulas and colors within this palette, so it's really fun to play around with this one. Next up, we have part of their Disney designer collection. This is the Midnight Masquerade palette. This palette is gorgeous, another one of my absolute favorites within my collection. I think the shades in here are gorgeous. I love the number of mattes you get in this palette. The one thing I don't enjoy are the 2 press glitters within this palette. I know I just talked about how fun it was to have a pressed glitter in the previous palette, but if I'm being completely honest, I really do not use those that often, and with only 15 shades, I feel like I would have liked to see just either a regular shimmer or another matte within this palette, just because having 2 pressed glitters in here kind of takes away what you can do with this palette in my opinion. But the other shades in here are absolutely gorgeous. This Mama Odie shade is a beautiful kind of pink to green shifting shade. Frog and Wife is a gorgeous green shimmer. The mattes in here complement each other really nicely, so this is definitely one of my favorite palettes. And then the gorgeous artwork you get up here as well is just beautiful. Alright, then this was actually part 1 of their Disney designer collection. This is their It's a Princess Thing palette, and the packaging of this one is my absolute favorite, and the color story is as well. This is my favorite palette in my collection, and I just absolutely love it. I am definitely someone who loves neutrals, so this one has a special place in my heart for that reason. And I feel like you do still get a couple fun pops of color. You get some purple shades, a couple pinkish shades. They're definitely not in your face by any means, but I will continue to rave about this palette. I absolutely love it. I seriously do not have anything bad to say about this palette. I just love it. Right then, my only ColourPop palette that is not a collab is their Garden Variety palette, another one of their 15 pan palettes. I am not sure if you can get this one anymore. I haven't looked at ColourPop's website in a very long time, but I do think this one's super pretty, especially for spring. I love the packaging of this one as well. There are definitely some shades in here that I really enjoy using. There are some shades that I don't really love as much, but it's still a beautiful palette, and while it's not one I reach for a ton, it is one that I do enjoy reaching for when I do enjoy the looks I create when I do reach for it. Alright, then my last ColourPop palette is from the Winnie the Pooh collab. This is their Sweet as Can Be palette. This packaging is adorable, and then the color story is super cute as well. I feel like I have not reached for this one in a while, which is so sad because I think it's gorgeous. The colors in here are super easy for me to use. I just haven't really found myself reaching for it, but I know I definitely need to, and this is a palette I will never get rid of. Even if I stop using it one day, this will definitely become a display piece for me just because I think it is so cute. And yeah, definitely one I'm going to need to be reaching for again soon. Alright, next up I have Rude Cosmetics, and I have all 5 of their Roaring Twenties palettes. So this first one is their Carefree palette, one of my favorite and one of the first that I purchased. This is a beautiful neutral kind of purple toned palette, and I do really enjoy the shades in here. I have a couple pans in this palette, and I just find this one super easy to use and really nice to reach for everyday looks. Next up we have the Reckless palette. This is one of the more colorful ones, a little bit more on the kind of jewel toned side, but you do still get some nice neutrals in here, which makes it easy to use. But I definitely feel like I reach into this one more for the colors. There are some gorgeous shades in here, and I just find this one really fun to play with. It's not one that I reach for a ton just because I feel like I've mentioned before, on a daily basis I am going for more neutral looks, but I definitely find this one fun to play with, and I have created some really fun colorful looks with this one. And then we have the Neons palette, which is even more colorful and fun. I fell in love with this one this past year. I've had it for a couple years now, but I really enjoyed using this one this past year. I do have one pan in it in Electric, which was part of my Pan Those Eyeshadows this past year, and I feel like that really helped me get some good use out of this palette, and I have just found different ways to make this work. Even though there's no true neutral brown shades within this palette, I have definitely found ways to work this into my everyday looks, and yeah, this one is just so much fun. Next up we have the Excessive palette, and we are back towards the more neutral side. This one is not a favorite of mine from this collection. I am still very happy to have it, and it's super easy to use. I've created some really pretty looks with it. It's just not the most exciting, but with that said, I do still really enjoy using this for everyday looks. It's going to be one that I find super easy to reach for. Even if it's not creating the most exciting looks, it's still easy to use. And then we have their Indulgence palette. This is their final installment of this Roaring Twenties collection so far. I don't know if they're coming out with more, but this is the most recent one. This one is also more on the neutral side, but this one is actually a newer favorite of mine. I find this one to be a little bit more exciting. I feel like there is a slight bit of variety, and it is, while there are a couple other neutral palettes within this Roaring Twenties collection, I find this one to be a little bit different, and I have created quite a few looks with this one that I have very much enjoyed. So Haven't had this one for long, but I have really enjoyed the looks I've created with it. Alright, next up we have Huda Beauty. This is their Desert Dusk palette. This one I had wanted for so long. I got a couple years ago. I didn't love it as much, but I've slowly started to realize why I wanted it so much. I have created some really pretty looks with this. I feel like there should be more variety in here than there does seem to be. I feel like a lot of the times the looks I create kind of end up looking the same, but I am kind of using the same couple of shades for each of the looks. So even mixing those shades with other ones, they still kind of turn out the same. But I have definitely found ways that I enjoy using this palette, and it's starting to become one that I am wanting to reach for more. And then we have their Nude Obsessions Light palette. This one is just so pretty and easy to use, and it's not one I'm reaching for a ton, surprisingly, even though this is a color story that I definitely could reach for every single day. It kind of gets lost a little bit within my collection, but it's still one that every time I look into this palette, I just re-fall in love with it. I think the color story is just super cute and, like I said, easy to use. So it's definitely one I am going to need to pull out more this next year. I think this would also make a really nice travel palette as well. I really haven't done that because it is a little bit more on the high-end side, so it kind of scares me to do that. But I feel like this would be a nice small little companion palette. Alright, next up we have Bala Cosmetics. I have their entire Flower Fields collection. There are 4 palettes. This first one up is the Daisy Days palette, and definitely my favorite out of this collection. Daisies are my favorite flower, and I absolutely just love the color story within this palette. It is more on the neutral side, but it does seem to be that a little bit more exciting neutrals in my opinion. And I love the few different pops we get within this palette to make it a little bit more exciting. There are a few shades in here I will say that I don't love. The glitter shade, I'm just not a big fan of glitters. And then these grays, I feel like just don't really look that great on my eyes. I will kind of have to test them out again. I took a pretty large break from using them just because I felt like they didn't really look that great, but I do kind of want to get back around to them and see if maybe I can make them work now. So we will have to see about those, but overall this palette is so good. I feel like it's more on the affordable side, but the quality is super nice, and yeah, I just really love this color story. Their next palette up is the Lotus Love, and this is the more pinky purple color story. This one was my favorite out of these for a while, but honestly it has gone down a little bit. I still find it super fun to reach for, and I still do enjoy this color story. I'm just not really reaching for these brighter shades at the moment, but maybe come like spring, early summertime, this will definitely be one that I find myself wanting to reach for, because I feel like that's the time of year when I'm reaching for these pinky purple shades. So definitely one I want to hold out for and use a little bit more. It's not one that I don't use at all. I am still reaching into it. I just have other palettes that I'm currently reaching for a little more. Next up is their Oh Poppy palette. So this one is definitely more of the warm toned palette. I have found myself wanting to reach for this one more lately. There are a couple shades within this palette that I want to hit pan on, and I find when I'm motivated by hitting pan, I want to reach for a palette more often, and this is one of those. I think it's a really nice palette. Again, the quality of these is super nice, especially for being on the more affordable side. This one does have a glitter, which I actually have pan in. I think I hit pan on that when I was using it on my nails one time. So that is definitely how I like to use the glitters within my collection if I have to use them. But this one has a lot of other shades in here that I like to use on my eyes, create some more warm tone looks, some pretty sunset looks. So that is definitely how I like to use this palette. And the last one up in the Flower Feels collection is the Sweet Sunflower. This is the yellow tone neutral palette. This one is definitely my least favorite out of these four. I really like the mattes in here, but the shimmers, the quality of them is good, but the colors aren't my favorite. Yellow tone golds are just not my favorite, and there are two kind of more yellow tones in here. And the one shimmer that I do really love is Paradise, light, easy to use, but the other shimmers within this palette I just find I'm not wanting to reach for as much, but I feel like I definitely need to start reaching back into the mattes because just looking at them, I feel like they look super nice. So if anything, I do want to get a lot more use out of the matte shades, and this is part of a collection, so I definitely won't be getting rid of it anytime soon unless I plan to get rid of the whole collection, which I know I'm not going to do. I know it might be kind of weird to keep palettes that I'm not absolutely in love with, but I love being a collector, and this is just my personal preference and what I want to keep, so definitely holding on to this one. Alright, next up we have Nomad Cosmetics. Nomad is a brand I feel like I have been purchasing from a lot more recently. So this first one up here is the America's Parks palette. This is my first one from them and kind of what started my obsession. The color story of this one is super pretty. It's one I definitely know I need to reach for more. I feel like you can't really see much use on it at all. I promise I have used it. I do need to reach into it more. But gorgeous. It's really inspires me whenever I look into this. So really happy to have this palette. Next up is their Province palette. This one is one of my favorites from Nomad. I think the color story of this one is kind of unique in my collection. Like, I don't really have this mix of colors in a different palette, I don't feel like. And there's just something about this color story that I absolutely love. I've created so many looks with this palette that I've just fallen in love with. Like I said, this is one of my favorite Nomad palettes, and I think that will just continue to be the case because this color story, their formula, just everything about it, I really enjoy. Next up is their Okavango Safari palette, and this is a newer one, but definitely a new favorite of mine. I love the neutrals mixed with the green shades within this palette. Neutrals, of course, I've said this before, are definitely an everyday look for me, and greens are a color I have really gotten into this past year, so having them combined with the neutrals just makes it really easy for me to incorporate them in everyday looks. And again, Nomad's formula, I really enjoy it. And yeah, this color story, just while it is on the more neutral side, I feel like it's a more exciting neutral palette, and I just love it. Next up we have their Royal Europe palette, and in this one they did the row of multi-chromes, which was super unique for them, and I feel like they turned out super pretty. This is not a palette I'm reaching for a ton, just because this is kind of a true jewel tone palette, which completely goes with the theme. I knew it when I bought it, but it's just not an everyday palette for me. But with that said, this one is so much fun for me to play with. I love using it for my Instagram and YouTube. I have found ways to pair this one with other palettes to kind of take those looks to the next level with some of these shades. So this is one that I know I'm not going to reach for a ton, especially on its own for everyday looks, but it's one that I still love having and love incorporating into different looks. Then my last Nomad palette is their Ghost Town USA palette. This was their Halloween release this year, and I think the color story of this one is gorgeous. I love that it's kind of split into the neutral half and then the cool toned colored half. I feel like it looks super spooky and kind of fall toned, but it's a different fall tone than some of the other palettes within my collection, and I just think the color story of this one is beautiful. I will be interested to see how much I'm reaching for outside of the spooky season. I didn't really reach for it much during the Christmas season, so I'm going to be interested to see how much I reach for it the rest of the year. But like I said, gorgeous color story. The shades in here perform super nicely, so one I am so happy to have. Alright, next we have a few from Hot Topic. This one is their Pokemon eyeshadow palette. I don't think you can get any of these anymore. They don't really keep their eyeshadow palettes around for too long, but they are constantly replacing them with other ones if you want to go check them out. I can speak on the quality. I think it is actually pretty good. I feel like with Hot Topic you do get hit or miss palettes, but from the ones I've tried from them, they are pretty good. This one is not really a favorite within my collection. I don't really know what it is. I think the color story is pretty. There's just nothing super special about it. And I definitely find I'm reaching for other palettes over this one. I think the theme is cute. I was super into Pokemon when I was a kid, so I love the theme of this one and the little Pokeball imprints in here. So it's one that I definitely want to see if I can reach for a little more in the next year or so and kind of determine by then if I want to keep this one or not. Next up we have a Winnie the Pooh Christmas eyeshadow palette. Such cute packaging, and then the color story in here looks like this. I feel like I ended up reaching for this a little more this past year because it was a part of my Pan Those eyeshadows, which is super lucky because I wasn't really reaching for this one. Again, this wasn't a palette that I found super exciting. I, again, love the theming of this, and it's kind of why I've kept this palette, kept both of these palettes, but it's one that while I was reaching into it, I really enjoyed it. After I put it away when it rolled out of Pan Those eyeshadows, I really haven't reached for it since. So again, another one I feel like I definitely need to kind of tell myself to use and test out a little more so I can kind of determine what I want to do with it. I won't ever get rid of this palette just because I do love the packaging and the theming, but it's kind of going to be one that maybe I just want to display. Then we have another Winnie the Pooh palette. This is the Happy Halloween palette. This one I absolutely love from Hot Topic. When I first tested this one out, I was blown away by the quality of this. It's not the absolute best quality in the world, I will not say that, but the quality for kind of what I was expecting from a Hot Topic palette, it blew that away, and I just absolutely love this. This is kind of a traditional fall color story for me, and I feel like it's super pretty. I don't reach for a ton outside of the fall season, but definitely for that season I find this one super fun to use, and like I said, the quality of this one was really good. Alright, we are moving on to our last basket of palettes. Alright, so the first brand from this basket I want to talk about is NYX Cosmetics, and this is their Nouveau Neutrals palette. This one I have had for quite a while, and it has definitely gone down in usage, but every time I look into this, I still really enjoy it. I think it is a really nice neutral palette. You get some good variety within the neutrals. I kind of always say that this is a neutral lover's dream palette because you get some kind of cooler tone purple shades, you get some classic browns, you get your warm tones, you get some pinks. So I feel like this kind of gives some good variety within those neutral colors, and the quality is super nice. I'm not sure this palette is available anymore, but I do still really enjoy this one. Alright, next up from NYX Cosmetics, I have their Miss Claus So Spoiled palette. This was their holiday palette from a couple years ago, I believe, and again, I don't think you can get this one anymore, but it is one that I still really love. I think the color story of this one is super nice, and the tiny little pans are so cute, and I feel like there is a lot of variety within this palette. I find it super easy and fun to use. I've created some really pretty looks within this palette. Not all of the shades are my favorite, and I feel like, especially with the shimmers, the formula is a little hit or miss. There are some that are a little flakier and sheerer, but there are some in here that perform really nicely as well. So this is definitely a palette that I really enjoy using. Alright, next up I have a few palettes from Sigma. So this first one is their Cinderella palette. I think the color story of this one is super pretty, and this is one that I am constantly being drawn to reach for. It's not one I reach for all the time, but it's one that after going a little while without reaching for it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to reach for this palette. I think it's so pretty. So definitely one I enjoy. I think that they did a really nice job with this one. I love the fact that it's not a true just blue palette like the iHeart Revolution Cinderella palette is. I think that palette's gorgeous, but I love that they didn't do that with this one. They did a bit more variety within this palette, which is super nice. The formula is pretty nice. Sigma doesn't have my absolute favorite formula, but it's still nice and fairly easy to use, so no real issues there. So yeah, definitely really enjoy this palette. Next up is their Untamed palette. This one is my least favorite from Sigma, and honestly quite low on my ranking of all of my palettes. I just look into this one and I'm not the most inspired. I still want to keep it and test it out some more because this is a little bit more of an expensive palette. I feel like I kind of need to keep it, which probably isn't the best mindset, but I did spend money on this one and I do want to get some use out of it, but I have a feeling that once the time comes for me to be ready to declutter this one, I will do so, but I'm just honestly not ready yet. I think I can still get some use out of this palette, and I'd like to see how much I can do with it. And my last Sigma palette is their Enchanted palette. I think this one's really pretty. Again, it's not one I reach for a ton. Like I said, Sigma's formula isn't my favorite, especially when it comes to the shimmers. I feel like they're a little bit more on the sheer side, which I don't super love. There are some shimmers in here though that I do find really nice, and the mattes in here perform nicely as well. This is a really nice spring tone palette for me, and I find that that is most often when I'm reaching for this one. So definitely one I do enjoy, but one I, again, need to reach for more. You can see a theme with my palettes here. Next up we have the Shared Planet Tiger palette. This is from an indie brand. I don't know if they're still doing stuff. I really hope that they haven't completely gone away because I love this palette. This is one of the more neutral ones within my collection, but one of my first more exciting neutral palettes in my opinion. I think the shades in here are so pretty, and I do enjoy the formula of these shades. Some of the shimmers are a little bit more on the flaky side, but there are some in here as well that perform beautifully. And yeah, I really enjoy this palette. I think it's super fun. Again, a little bit more of a fall tone palette for me, but this is one that I will reach for year round. So absolutely love this palette, and I really, really hope that Shared Planet isn't done coming out with products. Alright, next up I have 3 palettes from ABH. This first one is my Modern Renaissance palette. Definitely my favorite of my ABH palettes. There was a while where this was my favorite palette in my entire collection. It's still definitely up there, like probably top 3. But it's one that has kind of decreased in usage since I've gotten a little bit more into colors, but I still love my neutrals, and this is one of my favorite neutral color stories. I think it is beautiful. I have quite a few pans, as you can see, within this palette, and am definitely looking to get more. This is a palette I would love to fully pan at some point in the future, so definitely one I want to slowly keep working towards that goal with. And like I said, love the color story. The formula still performs pretty nicely in my opinion. I haven't really noticed any real decrease in the formula, so this is definitely one I will continue to hang on to and use. Next up is the Soft Glam palette. This was one of my most used of 2023, I feel like. I had quite a few of these shades in my pan, those eyeshadows, which really helped, but I think if I remember correctly, I hit 4 out of the 6 pans I have in this palette this past year, so really loved kind of getting to know this palette a little more. I feel like the formula of this one is my favorite out of the ABH palettes and might be one of my favorite formulas in my collection as well. I think it is super nice, easy to use. You are just getting neutrals within this palette, but I knew that going in with this palette, so it is super nice for those everyday looks. You can kind of build them up and intensify them a little bit to make them a little more interesting and unique, and yeah, I do really enjoy this palette. Alright, then I have the Subculture palette, and this one is definitely a little bit more on the colorful side compared to the last two, and as you can see, definitely my least used. I did get this one a year or two after the other ones, so it has not been in my collection as long, but I still have had this one, I think, for a year now, so definitely one I need to continue to reach for. I am getting slight dips in some of these shades, which is really exciting, and it is one that I have a ton of fun playing with when I do reach into this, and I have found that I have been reaching for it more often lately, so this is one that I am enjoying and I do enjoy having in my collection. Next up, from Essence, we have their Salute Paris palette. This is one, when I first got it, I received this as a gift, and I was not the most excited about this palette, but as I have used this more, I have kind of fallen in love with it. To be honest, there are only a few shades in here that I'm continuously reaching for, and I bet you can tell which ones those are, the ones with the big dips in them, but those three shades create such a beautiful everyday look. Super simple for me to throw on when I don't really want a ton of makeup on. I just want some slight wash of color. This is perfect. I do have a couple parts of this palette that I don't love. I wish they hadn't done two shades that basically look the exact same. One is slightly lighter than the other, but they perform the exact same. I don't really see the point of them both in this palette. And then this shade over here does not show up at all on the eyes, which is super disappointing. Luckily, it's just a classic brown shade, which I have many times over within my collection, but I would have liked if all of the shades within this palette at least performed somewhat nicely, but there are definitely shades in here that I do love as well, which I pointed out to you. So this is one I will continue to keep around and use, at least until I get closer to using those ones up. Next up, we have my Pacifica Purple Nudes palette. I purchased this one at the beginning of 2023, and it is slowly becoming a favorite of mine. I am someone who loves purple eyeshadow, especially more neutral tone purples, so this one really spoke to me when I first saw it. I think the formula is really nice, and yeah, this palette is just super cute. I have really enjoyed playing around with it, and I am thinking that will definitely continue into 2024. Alright, next up we have my Wet n Wild collection. This is the brand I owned the most from before the iHeart Revolution Disney Princess palettes came along. So this first one is the Wet n Wild Au Naturel palette. You cannot get this one anymore, I don't think, and this is the oldest palette in my collection, I believe, but I still enjoy keeping it around, specifically for this shade right here. That shade is my favorite within my entire collection, and I am going to find it very hard to let go of this palette in the future just because of that shade. There are shades in my collection that are similar to this one, but none of them are truly an exact dupe for that shade, so I feel like I will continue to keep this around for a little while longer, which is good because I do still want to show some more use on this palette. There are a few shades in here still that I would love to hit pan on before eventually decluttering it sometime in the future. So definitely one I want to continue to reach for. Next up is from their Pac-Man collab. This is the Game Over palette, and this is another one that I found myself really enjoying reaching for this past year. Again, thanks to my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, I had this shade in there, and I did end up hitting pan, as you can see. So having shades within that project really helps me reach into a palette and kind of figure out how I like to use it. This still isn't a super used palette within my collection, and I will admit part of that is because the little Ghost and Pac-Man imprints, I don't really want to mess up too much. I have pictures of them, so it's okay if I do, but I think they're super cute, and I just love how this palette looks with them in it. So that is just kind of a mindset thing I need to get past, but I do love this palette and the theming of it. I bought the entire Pac-Man collection from Wet n Wild, and I absolutely love it. Alright, next up I have some of their 10-pan palettes. This was before they kind of reformulated and repackaged, and I really liked the formula and packaging of these ones. I wish they had stuck with it. If I remember correctly, you can still get this packaging and color stories on their website. I don't think they have taken those down yet. So this is their Rose in the Air palette. As you can tell, it's my favorite from these palettes. This is definitely the most used, most panned palette within my collection. I have 2 left to hit pan on, which I'm really hoping to accomplish this next year. This is kind of my unofficial pan that palette for the next year. This is a color story, like I mentioned with the Modern Renaissance, since this is a dupe for the Modern Renaissance. I loved this color story for so long at one point. It's not my absolute favorite anymore, but it is still one I enjoy, so I think I can definitely finish panning this palette, and that is just going to be such a huge goal accomplished. Next up is their Not a Basic Peach palette, and this is one I momentarily was debating decluttering this year, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it yet. There are still shades in here that I would love to use and pan, so I was just not ready to get rid of this one yet. I think the color story of this one is super cute. I absolutely loved it when I first got it. It was a little bit more colorful in my collection when I first got it, and now obviously I have a lot more colors, so this one isn't as exciting anymore, but it's still one that I find myself wanting to continue to use. Alright, then my last Wet n Wild palette is the Stop Playing Safe palette, and this one I did not get at the same time as the previous 2, so it's not used as much, but I still have had this one for a little while, and no, I definitely need to reach into this a bit more. There are shades in here that I think are gorgeous, and I would love to continue to use a bit more and show a little more love, especially compared to the other 2 from this same kind of style. Alright, next up from Maybelline, I have their Lemonade Craze palette. This is another palette that I would like to use as kind of an unofficial pan that palette. I find the shades in here are super easy to hit pan on, and I currently have 5 out of 12 shades panned. So definitely an easy palette for me to use, easy to reach for, and I really enjoy this palette. Alright, only a couple more brands to talk about. This first one is Beautiful Shellz Cosmetics. I have 2 of their Karma Chameleon quads. So this first one is the Iris quad. Unfortunately, I don't think they have these available anymore. I think it was a once they're sold out, they're not coming back situation, but Beautiful Shellz does have some other color stories and palettes on their website that are really pretty. My mom got one of their palettes, and I believe it's still available. It's like the Mountains and Palm Trees palette. That one is super pretty, and I have tested that out from her before, so I really enjoy that one. And if you're interested in picking anything up from Beautiful Shellz, I do have an affiliate link. It's always linked in my description box towards the bottom if you're interested. No pressure, no need to use it, but I always just want to put that out there, and you can save a little bit of money using my code if you're interested. So back to these palettes. This is the Iris Chameleon quad. I think it is super pretty, and I feel like for having 4 shades in this palette, there is still quite a bit of variety within it with the couple of matte shades you have in here. And I love the fact that you can go kind of with the blues and purples, the reds and the purples, or you can combine the matte shades to create more of a purple tone matte and mix all of these shades together, which is super fun to do. Alright, then their Peach Chameleon quad. I absolutely love this one. It's a little easier for me to use because it is slightly more on the neutral side, and this duochrome shade down here is gorgeous. I absolutely love it. It works best on a finger, but it looks so beautiful. It has kind of a wet finish on the lid. I'm obsessed with that shade. I could go on and on about it. I absolutely love it. The other shades in here are pretty nice as well. The mattes perform nicely. I'm not as big a fan of this one just because of the color of it is not my favorite, but it still performs super nicely. I really have enjoyed the palettes I've tested out from Beautiful Shellz. Alright, last brand I have to talk about is Nabla. I have 3 palettes from them. So this first one is their Dreamy palette. This one I thought was going to be my favorite from Nabla, but honestly I have not used it as much as I thought I would. It's still a really nice palette, a little bit more on the neutral side. There are some shades in here that are super pretty, and when I look into this palette, I do really want to reach for, but there are also shades in here that just don't super excite me, and I just find that I'm not really reaching for this one a ton. It's still one that I would love to show more progress on and continue to use, like a lot of the other palettes within my collection. It's one that I want to fall in love with still, so I am definitely keeping this one around and would love to use it more. Alright, next up from Nabla is their Secret palette, and this one definitely has my favorite color story of my Nabla palettes. I think it's just so light and bright, and I really like the variety within this one. You have your neutral colors, but you also have some fun pops in here as well. I think there's some good variety. I've created so many looks with this palette, and I do really enjoy it. I still don't use it as much as some of the other palettes within my collection, but I still do really like this color story, and I really enjoy Nabla's formula. They have one of my favorite formulas within my collection, I feel like. Even though I don't use it a ton, it's still super nice. Alright, the final palette within my collection is my Nabla Poison Garden palette, and I do enjoy this one. I feel like I go in stages of really liking it to not really using it a ton, and it just kind of goes back and forth. There are definitely shades in here that are not my favorite just color-wise, but there are other shades in here that I do really enjoy, and I have had some fun creating different looks within this palette. I feel like there's not as much variety in this one compared to some other ones, but it's still super nice, easy to use for everyday looks, so I do enjoy it for that reason. So that will go ahead and wrap up my entire eyeshadow palette collection for 2024. I just absolutely love eyeshadow. As you can tell, I do have quite a large collection, and I'm so excited to see what kind of use I can get on these palettes this year. Let me know what you guys thought of this video. What is your favorite palette within your collection? Give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future uploads. And with all of that said, I will see you in my next video. Bye!